Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, get any updates to the forecasts, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, get any updates to the forecast through that means as well, or you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a quick look down in southeast Alaska where we are expecting off to a dry start, which is resulting in some warmer temperatures expecting to move into the area. The warmest of those temperatures will be on Thursday, and we are expecting to hit temperatures into the mid to upper 70s tomorrow, as well as getting into the 70s in Juneau, a little bit warm there as well. As we look up north into the Fairbanks area, we can see temperatures this afternoon throughout much of the mainland part of the state. Especially along the Arctic coastline, where we did see some cooler than normal temperatures this morning, but we are expecting those highs to get back up to around normals. So you can see a lot of mid-60s through much of the interior, and then expecting another warm couple of days for the interior portions of the state as well as we move forward in time. Taking a look at our fire danger, we do have some up in the upper Yukon Valley, an area of high fire danger, and then down in the western portions of the Kenai Peninsula, as well as in southeastern portions of the Copper River Basin. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we'll focus on the main system moving into our areas. You can see out over the Bering Sea, we have a system pushing up from the southwestern portions of the Bering up to the more northern locations of the Bering Sea. And as we watch this again, you can see the trail of moisture being pulled up to the west coast as a lot of the cloud cover is starting to make its way over the west coast of the state, the eastern Aleutian Islands, and out by the Alaska Peninsula as well. Behind this system, another weaker low is moving up towards the western Aleutian Islands. We can see some cloud cover out ahead of that one. And then finally, as we look out over mainland Alaska, high pressure is dominating much of the area. But as we get up to the northeastern parts of the mainland, we can see that weak circulation there. It is an upper level low that's bringing some colder air aloft to the northeastern portions of the state. Taking a look now at our weather for the remainder of the day, we'll start off with our low out over the northern part of the Bering Sea. That's bringing in a lot of that moisture from the south. You can see those southerly winds pushing in through much of the central and eastern Aleutians, bringing rain with them, and up through much of the central part of the Bering Sea, bringing rain to the Pribilof Islands, then up the west coast from the YK Delta area through the Seward Peninsula to include St. Lawrence Island, where we are seeing some areas of fog up there in the more northern locations. Further to the south, we have high pressure that is sitting out over the southwestern portion of the Gulf of Alaska. That's going to kind of hang in place over the next couple of days, extending some of that ridging out over southern portions of the mainland, helping with some of that warmer air that we are expecting to curve through the remainder of the week. And we also have an area of high pressure over the Arctic coastline that's going to remain there as well. So we have these two areas of high pressure with weaker areas of lower pressure in between them, resulting in some areas of instability, resulting in some of those lighter showers that we see over the central and western portions of the interior, as well as some thunderstorms up in the northeastern parts of the Brooks Range. Then down along the North Gulf Coast, high pressure is keeping a lot of the precipitation away. That's going to extend out over the southeastern portion of the state as well, where the Panhandle, not expecting to see a lot of rain. However, we do have some just to the north of the fjords there. As we move into tonight, some of that rain is going to sneak into the southern portions of the Panhandle. However, the central and northern locations should stay pretty clear of most of the precipitation. That's going to stretch along the North Gulf Coast, where we aren't expecting to see a lot of precipitation. However, our area of high pressure does sit there to the south of Kodiak Island, extending up some of that ridging, and our other area of high pressure out over the Arctic coastline, extending into those central and eastern portions of mainland Alaska, keeping much of the precipitation pretty light. We do have some isolated areas of showers expected over the eastern parts of the Brooks Range, as well as our area of rain extending in from the west coast, pushing further into the western portions of the interior and at other locations of southwest Alaska. Still some areas mixed with fog for the Norton and Kotzebue Sounds, as well as out by St. Lawrence Island. That system is also pulling up some of that rain into areas of the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. And then behind this system, we do have another system approaching the western Aleutian Islands, starting to bring some rain towards the western Aleutians throughout the night tonight. Then on Thursday, that rain is going to make it there, as that system is actually weakening now on Thursday, but bringing enough to bring rain to the western Aleutian Islands. We're going to have continued lingering showers over the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, as well as our old system breaking down but still pushing in rain to the west coast of the state and pushing that rain even further into central locations of the interior, as well as down into the Alaska Range and Talkeetna Mountains. Up along the Arctic coastline, high pressure is still keeping most of the precipitation at bay, but we will have some lingering out over the eastern locations. And then still not seeing a lot of activity down around the North Gulf Coast. However, in our area of the Panhandle, we are expecting some of the rain that was in the southern locations to creep into central locations as well. However, northern locations should be pretty clear of most of the precipitation on Thursday, and a lot of clear skies allowing for some of those warmer temperatures to come in. And with the northerly winds expected through areas up in the Lynn Canal area, we are expecting to prohibit the sea breeze from forming by Haines and Skagway, allowing them to get a little bit warmer there, getting them to those mid to upper 70s. Then on Friday, we are expecting some lighter flow over the area of the Panhandle with some clearing up north, allowing for some warmer temperatures, not quite as warm as we'll see on Thursday, with cloud cover in central and southern locations of the Panhandle, lingering light rain showers for the very southern locations. Out over mainland Alaska, eastern locations should stay pretty clear, but as we get to central and western locations, expecting rain to linger throughout the day on Friday, with some lighter rain along the west coast. And down for the Kodiak Island area, continuing to see not a lot of precipitation with the high pressure further to the south, holding in place through the end of the week. Out over the Aleutians, we do have another system coming up from the south, bringing another round of rain and southerly winds to the central and western Aleutians, as well as out by the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. Some of that rain making it around the Pribilof Islands area as well. For our low temperatures starting Thursday morning, we'll stay out in the Aleutian Islands, dropping down to the mid-40s for most locations. Unalaska staying a little bit warmer, 52 degrees expected low. Then down in the southwestern portions of the state around Bristol Bay in the mid to upper 40s for those lows, right around 50 degrees for the YK Delta area, extending up into the Norton Sound as well. Kotzebue Sound area, Shishmaref dropping down to 36, but Kotzebue staying up at around 52 degrees. Up along the Arctic coastline, most locations dropping down into the mid-30s, but as we get to the more western locations, we are expecting those to stay in the 40s. Then moving into the interior portions of the state, those areas with that southerly wind that's bringing up the warmer air from the south, we are expecting to stay right around 50 degrees for the western portions of the interior. Galena staying at around 50 degrees, but central and eastern locations will drop down into the mid-40s. Down in south central portions of the state, dropping down to the mid-40s for most locations. Anchorage staying a little bit warmer, 52. Also expecting 52 degrees at Kodiak. And then down in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down to the lower 50s for the most part. A couple areas closer towards the water staying a little bit colder, getting down to around 49 degrees at Yakutat. Moving into Thursday afternoon, temperatures jumping up to around 70 degrees for much of the Panhandle. Again, those more northern locations, we are expecting some warmer temperatures. 74 degrees expected for Juneau. And then as we move into south central Alaska, getting up right around 70 degrees most locations. Some of those places by the water expecting to stay a little bit cooler in the 60s there. Then up in the interior, all locations getting into those mid to upper 60s are expected. Fort Yukon getting a little bit warmer, 70 degrees is expected for the high. Up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures getting up into the 40s for eastern locations. Then some places getting up to as high as 65 for those western locations. Going to stay warmer out west along the Arctic coast. As we drop down the west coast of the state along the water, staying in the lower 50s. And then down in southwest Alaska, YK Delta area, getting up into the mid-50s, getting up to around 60 degrees for the Bristol Bay area, with king salmon getting up to 68, into the 50s for the Alaska Peninsula, and right around 50 degrees for the Aleutian Islands. Friday morning, dropping back down to the mid-40s for the Aleutians, into the lower to mid-50s for the Bristol Bay area, into the mid to upper 40s for much of the YK Delta area and Norton Sound area, into the 40s for most locations around the Kotzebue Sound, and dropping down into the mid-30s for those eastern locations of the Arctic coastline, still staying warmer for the western locations, dropping down into the 40s there. Right around 50 degrees expected for the low for all of the interior, and then similarly down by the south central area, dropping down to right around 50 degrees, warmer out by the water, and then dropping down to the lower 50s for much of the panhandle area. Friday afternoon expected highs, we are looking at temperatures getting up into the lower 60s for central and southern locations of the panhandle, up to around 70 degrees for northern locations, mid 70s for south central, upper 60s for much of the interior, warmer to the east, into the 40s for much of the Arctic coastline, and then down the west coast right around 50 degrees, getting warmer as we get further to the south, mid 60s for the Bristol Bay area, right around 50 degrees for the Aleutian Islands with 56 at St. Paul.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather. Starting off over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we do have widespread IFR conditions. Those conditions are going to extend up much of the west coast of the state into the Seward Peninsula area. But as we get to mainland Alaska, expecting conditions to clear out and widespread VFR conditions from much of the mainland, again excluding that west coast. And then up along the Arctic coastline, some MVFR conditions are expected as well. Down in southeast Alaska, we are expecting VFR conditions. And then on Thursday afternoon, continued VFR conditions for the majority of our southeastern portions of the state. Some areas of MVFR starting to sneak into the very southern portions. Out over mainland Alaska, continuing to see primarily VFR for much of the central and eastern locations, but as we get to the west coast, those MVFR and IFR conditions that we'll see Thursday morning will extend a little bit further to the east, encompassing a little bit more of the western portions of the state. Up along the Arctic coastline, continuing to see some isolated areas of MVFR conditions, and then down in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, continuing to see widespread IFR conditions. Friday morning, another time for IFR conditions for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Those IFR conditions now extending further into the west coast as we have an easterly progression of those lower ceilings and visibilities moving into western portions of the Alaska Range and even some areas of the western part of the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, IFR and MVFR conditions expected. And then for much of the eastern portions of mainland Alaska, VFR conditions that will extend down into much of southeast. Again, in the very southern portions, some MVFR and IFR conditions lingering. In Friday afternoon, the IFR conditions are going to leave us in the southeastern portions of the state, but the MVFR conditions are going to spread further into the central locations of the Panhandle. Eastern portions of mainland Alaska continue to see VFR conditions Friday afternoon, but MVFR conditions for much of the central and western portions of the state, as well as along the Arctic coastline. Then down in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, continuing to see IFR conditions. Moving into the passes, starting up north at AKwx Pass, as we saw, much of the mainland part of the state was going to be in VFR conditions. That's going to be true for these passes as well. AKwx is going to be VFR for Thursday, as well as at Adigan Pass. Down in the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill will both be VFR throughout the day, as well as Rainy Pass, Windy Pass, Isabel Pass, and Mentasta Pass. Then for Tenedo Pass, expecting VFR conditions throughout the day on Thursday, as well as at Portage. And then for Chilkoot and White, both expecting to be VFR throughout the day on Thursday. For our freezing levels, starting way up north, we do have an area of our surface freezing just off the north coast line, and then that's going to extend an area of colder air out over the northeastern portions of the state. Some warmer air expected with those higher freezing levels up to as high as 12,000 feet for the central Aleutians out into the central Bering, and then another little area out by the Kodiak Island and Alaska Peninsula area. Taking a look at our icing, main one for the state is going to be over the far northeastern portions of mainland Alaska. Above 7,000 feet is expected. For our jet stream, wrapping around our low out over the northeastern portions of the state, 95 knots out of a westerly direction to the south of that low, and then 130 knot jet out of a southerly direction just to the east of that low. Primarily going to see westerly flow out over much of the state, 60 knots along the coastline, 75 knots out of that westerly direction by St. Matthew Island, down by the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians, 65 knots there, and then out by the western Aleutians, 70 knots out there. And then down over the Panhandle area, northerly winds, 55 knots are expected. Dropping down to 9,000 feet, continuing to see stronger northerly winds out over the Panhandle, up to as high as 50 knots over the southern and eastern locations. Much of mainland Alaska pretty calm until we get to the west coast, where we'll see as high as 50 knots out of a southwesterly direction over the YK Delta area. Dropping down to around 40 knots as we get up by the Seward Peninsula, and then around 35 knots as we get up further along the northwest coast. Down in the Aleutian Islands, going to see the strongest winds for the eastern Aleutians. Southwesterly winds 40 knots expected there, 30 knots out of the southwest over the central Aleutians, and then 25 knots by the western Aleutians. Taking us down to 3,000 feet, continuing to see the strongest winds out over mainland Alaska along the west coast of a southerly direction, 35 knots extending from the Alaska Peninsula through the YK Delta area and through the Kotzebue Sound area, all at that 35 knots. Down over the Panhandle area, northerly winds continuing, 35 to 40 knots expected, higher by Yakutat around 45 knots there. Then out over the Aleutians, we are expecting some winds around 30 knots out of a southerly direction right by the western Aleutians. For our turbulence, primarily along the west coast where we saw those stronger winds, below 4,000 feet is expected for many of the areas from Point Hope down through the YK Delta, including St. Lawrence Island. By the eastern Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula, below 4,000 feet is expected, and below 3,000 feet by the western Aleutian Islands.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, joined again by Eric Stevens of GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And Eric, thanks so much for joining us again tonight.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Thanks, Eric. And we've been talking about the complex gathering of information from satellites, looking down on the surface of the planet. And some of those orbits around the planet work for Alaska, and some of them don't. There's a lot of challenges with those. How can we get better imagery for the poles and specifically for Alaska?
Right. Well, today we're going to talk about a very interesting kind of satellite orbit that has potential to be real helpful for the high latitudes.
Okay.
Especially us here in Alaska. Canadians, Russians, Norwegians will all be interested in this. The satellites are not in orbit yet. Now the future is uncertain, but it's possible, and if this happens, it will be wonderful for Alaska. Okay. It's called the highly elliptical orbit.
Oh, that sounds
it's interesting. Yeah. And I think first, to help our discussion, we should get back to some of Kepler's laws and how do satellites work.
Sure.
Kepler's first law, an orbit of a planet around a sun or a weather satellite around the Earth is not necessarily a circle, it's an ellipse.
Okay.
And the highly elliptical orbit takes advantage of this aspect. We're going to put the Earth in one of the ellipse and then stretch one of the foci of the ellipse and then stretch that ellipse out real far to make it highly elliptical.
The foci is that bend part of the end of the ellipse. If you're going to stretch out a rubber band, that would be the center, kind of the stretchy part.
Yes.
Ends. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then Kepler's second law says that the closer something is to the thing that it's orbiting, the faster it goes.
Okay.
We see this in the solar system, that Mercury flies around the sun real fast. Jupiter, much slower. Jupiter's further away, it's slower. Mercury's closer in, it's faster. This happens with weather satellites too. Even satellites like the International Space Station, it's pretty close to the Earth. It goes around the Earth in only 90 minutes. That thing is moving. It's only 250 miles away. So how can we take advantage of these two aspects of Kepler's laws of motion to get better weather surveillance of Alaska? And this highly elliptical orbit is going to be the approach. So we have with us today our friendly planet Earth and our simulated satellite, the lid off of this salt shaker
like
here.
Sputnik there. Yeah.
There it is. It's shiny, it's metal, it's space worthy. And what we want to be able to do is, could you have a satellite hover over the top of the world, up over Alaska? You can't really do that. Geostationary satellites have to be over the equator. Okay. So how could we almost solve this? And this is the tricky part. Maybe should we tilt the Earth over?
Focus on the pole. That's what we're trying to accomplish here, right?
So here we have the northern side of the planet, and we're going to trace out the orbit of a satellite with this salt shaker lid here. Now imagine a highly elliptical orbit. So let's put the Earth in one of the foci of the ellipse, and we'll have an imaginary foci out here. So the satellite will not go in a circle around the Earth, but will be in this long strung out ellipse. So the satellite will go...
kind of like a racetrack.
Yes, there you go, like a racetrack. So it's an oval elliptical shape like that. And notice now that when the satellite's over here, we've got a nice view of the northern hemisphere around. There's Alaska, Russia, Canada, Greenland, all there. So that's the ellipse aspect of an orbit, Kepler's first law. The second law saying that when you're further away as a satellite, you go slower. And this we can take real
okay.
advantage of. Because the way this orbit works, when the satellite goes over Antarctica here,
Right.
it's going to be close to the Earth. It's
Okay.
going to be moving, whoosh, goes on by. And then as it comes out here, it will slow down. This increases what is known as the dwell time. The satellite will just hang here looking for hours at Alaska and the high Arctic. And then eventually it will come around and it will accelerate and whiz around the South Pole and then come back and hang here for a while because it's further away from the planet. It goes slower.
Yeah.
It has to. That's the laws of motion. And such like that, repeating.
Wow.
Now, the real important way to make this work is you have to have two satellites. So that while one is whipping around the pole, you've got the other one out here. And they work as a team. You could then get a series of images of Alaska that can be almost from a constant frame of reference.
Right.
And you can loop them together to make movies. You can take a picture every 10 minutes, say, of Alaska and then loop it, playing it at several frames a second. You could see the clouds whiz on by. You know, the Weather Channel, weather broadcasters in the lower 48 especially can show these movie loops from the geostationary satellites. In Alaska, we've never really been able to do that very well, especially in the higher, most northern parts of the state, because those geostationary satellites over the equator, it's not a good view. And this highly elliptical orbit whipping around the South Pole and then dwelling up here would be a way for us to get that constant frame of reference and do really good weather surveillance over the Arctic, seeing where those storms are, where they're going. Nothing quite like a movie loop of the weather in time to really illustrate what's important, what's going on.
And compared to what we have right now, we just have small windows or snapshots of what's going on with the polar orbiters. We don't have that long range view that's looking top down to give us that complete motion picture that helps us understand so much of the atmosphere at this
There's
point.
so many different kinds of satellites. Each has their advantage. Each is important, and the highly elliptical orbit satellite will also fit into that scheme. It's a nifty idea to solve an Alaskan challenge.
That's fantastic. Well, that sounds really exciting. And again, kind of a satellite dream of the future to come. Okay, very good. Thanks for joining us today, Eric. We really appreciate the information. And if you'd like to learn more about what Eric does at Dehne, at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we invite you to visit the web address that you see on your screen there. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For Marines, we'll start off with a look at our ice edge. There is of note we still have some shore-fast ice from AKwx east to Harrison Bay. However, that does continue to erode, and we do have some areas where the rivers are starting to bring in some water to start melt some of that ice as well. And then as we get further to the northeast along the Arctic coastline, there are starting to be some areas of open water that extend out over northwest Canada as well. Otherwise, the ice edge extends down by Point Lay area and then is further up north along much of the Arctic coastline. As we look into our marine forecast for southeast Alaska on Thursday, we have northerly winds through much of the central and northern parts of the inside waters, 20 to 30 knots, strongest to the north, with seas as high as 6 feet in Lynn Canal. And then down in the southern location, southeasterly winds, 15 knots expected. Out over the Gulf, northwesterly winds, 25 knots. Till we get up to the north, then we're going to drop down to 15 to 20 knots. Seas as high as 10 feet, highest in the south. Then on Friday, flow out over the Gulf going to continue to be out of a northwesterly direction, but diminish quite a bit, 10 to 15 knots expected throughout the Gulf. Inside waters, primarily a southerly direction and all around 10 knots there. For Thursday for south central Alaska, out over the Gulf waters, 15 to 20 knots for northern locations. Just to the east of the Barren Islands, westerly winds 25 knots expected there. Prince William Sound, northwesterly winds 15 knots expected. In Cook Inlet area, northwesterly winds 10 knots. And then out to the west of the Barren Islands, westerly winds 15 knots expected. On Friday in Cook Inlet, southwesterly winds 10 to 15 knots. Getting stronger as we get further to the south, west of the Barren Islands, westerly winds 20 knots. And then on the east side, up to as high as 25 knots. Out over the rest of the Gulf, westerly winds 15 knots until we get to those northeastern locations, southerly winds 10 knots there. And then Prince William Sound, northwesterly winds around 10 knots. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island on Thursday, starting off around Kodiak Island, west to southwest winds, 20 knots expected. And you can see the winds wrapping around the high pressure further to the south, where we have southerly winds south of the Alaska Peninsula becoming westerly as we get further towards Kodiak Island, all around 20 knots. And then on the Bering side of the peninsula, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots is expected. Seas as high as 6 feet, highest to the west. Then on Friday, continuing to see similar flow, southerly winds out to the west 15 to 20 knots, and then becoming more westerly as we get closer towards Kodiak Island, around 20 knots around the island, and then Bristol Bay a little bit weaker, southwest winds 10 knots. For the Aleutian Islands on Thursday, starting off for the central and eastern Aleutians, southerly winds 10 to 15 knots for the central areas, getting up to as high as 20 knots by the eastern Aleutians, and becoming more southeasterly by the western Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots there. Then on Friday, staying out by the western Aleutians, southwesterly winds 20 knots, getting up to as high as 25 knots as we get closer towards the central Aleutians out of a southerly direction, seas as high as 8 feet there. Now for the central Aleutians, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, and then by the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Along the west coast of the state, primarily a southerly wind component, 20 to 25 knots for most of the coastline, a little bit weaker by the Pribilof Islands, southwest 15 knots expected there. Seas up to as high as 11 feet up much of the west coast. Then on Friday, continuing to see that primarily southerly direction around 15 knots along the coastline, weaker in Norton Sound, only around 5 knots there. Then St. Matthew Island, southeast 20 knots, and southeast 15 knots by the Pribilof Islands. Up along the Arctic coastline, easterly direction, 10 to 20 knots, getting stronger as we get further to the west, and then down the west coast, east to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, until we get into the Bering Strait area, southerly winds 25 knots there, with seas as high as 11 feet. Then on Friday, continuing to see southerly winds extend up the west coast now to around 15 knots, then becoming easterly and 25 knots as we get up along the western portions of the Arctic coastline, then becoming northerly again, 15 to 20 knots along the eastern portions of the coastline. For our weather for the remainder of tonight, we do have that system out over the northern parts of the Bering Sea, extending rain and southerly winds up along the west coast, bringing rain from the YK Delta area through the Kotzebue Sound area and western portions of the interior, down as far south as the eastern Aleutian Islands and the Alaska Peninsula. Much of the mainland Alaska from central areas to the east should be pretty clear of precipitation until we get up into eastern portions of the Brooks Range, where some lingering showers will remain, and then southern portions of the Panhandle also expecting to see rain. As we move into Thursday, that rain in the Panhandle is going to extend to central locations as well, leaving the northern locations to get the warmest on Thursday as they stay out of that rain. In interior portions of the state, that rain along the west coast will linger. However, it will spread to more central locations to include the Alaska Range and Talkeetna Mountains. Then out by the western Aleutians, a new system coming in from the south, bringing another round of southerly winds and rain to the western Aleutian Islands.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.